So Simple tutorial. Good morning students, welcome to SST So Simple tutorial. My dear students, today we will be doing one short revision of the lesson Print Culture and the Modern World. If you have not seen the unit-wise explanation of the chapter, then I will suggest you to see them first to have a better understanding of the lesson. The complete playlist is given in the description below. Let us now begin our session with Unit 1, the first printed books. Students, printing had its beginning in East Asia. The earliest kind of print technology developed in China, Japan and Korea. This was a system of hand printing. The process was simple. The required matter was engraved on a wood block first. Then ink was applied on the surface of the wood block. A plain paper was then rubbed against the surface of that wood block. This left the required impression on the paper. But the quality of paper was not such as we have today. It was thin and porous, so pages could not be used on both the sides. Only one side was printed. The pages were then folded and stitched at the side. These books so closely resembled an accordion that they came to be known as accordion books. Now, when the books were ready, its copy were prepared. For this, skilled craftsmen, generally we call them scribes, were employed, who used to make its copies with great accuracy and beautiful handwriting. This is what is called calligraphy, is it not? The art of beautiful and stylized writing. Initially, till the 16th century, the use of hand printing was limited to the government. By government, I mean the imperial state of China. The government was the major producer of printed material. The imperial state used to recruit its civil servants through examinations. So the textbooks that were produced were basically meant for the candidates who were to take these exams. Understood? But in the next century, the use of print diversified in China. This was primarily due to the fact that urban culture was flourishing there. Print material no more remained the monopoly of the government. Others also began using print in their everyday lives. For example, merchants. They began using it to collect trade informations. People started reading books as a leisure activity. They preferred fictional narratives, poetry, autobiographies, anthologies of literary masterpieces, and romantic plays. Rich women also began to read. Many other women began to publish their poetry and plays. Wives of scholar officials also published their works. Now, as the time passed from 17th to 18th century and then to 19th century, there is a shift visible in China from hand printing to mechanical printing. Several European powers established their trading outposts in Shanghai. Hence, several Western-style schools were opened in Shanghai. These Western powers imported Western printing techniques and mechanical presses to print books to cater to these schools. Shanghai herself had a large number of literate people. They also wanted to read books. So books were printed using the new Western style techniques to satisfy the demands of such people. Shanghai thus became the hub of the new print culture. Now, around 768 to 770 AD, this hand printing technology moved to Japan through the Buddhist missionaries. Japanese then made a diverse use of this technology. They printed pictures on textiles, playing cards and paper money. Poetry and prose were regularly published. Books were cheap and available in abundance. Libraries and bookstores were packed with handwritten materials of various types. Books on women, musical instruments, calculations, tea ceremony, flower arrangements, cooking, etc. The oldest known Japanese book is the Buddhist Diamond Sutra. It was printed in 868 AD. Diamond Sutra contained 6 sheets of text and woodcut illustrations. Let us now see what is ukiyo. It is an art form in Japan. Ukiyo means pictures of floating world. These pictures depicted ordinary human experiences, especially urban ones. In ukiyo, an artist would draw a painting on an identified theme. Then a skilled wood block carver pasted the drawing on a wood block and carved the block. Thus, the original drawing was destroyed in the process, but the block remained, which could be used repeatedly to produce prints. Thus, printing technology helped in the fast spread of this art form. Kitigawa Utamaro was one such Japanese artist who is highly regarded for his ukiyo woodblock prints. Let us now revise the next unit, Print Comes to Europe. Dear students, just recall the first video of the chapter, The Making of the Global World. We had read about the Silk Routes. China had well-established trade with Europe through this Silk Route. China had invented paper also, and this Chinese paper used to reach Europe through the same Silk Route. The Europeans then made use of this paper to produce handwritten manuscripts. These manuscripts were written by skilled scribes. So this is how printing was happening in Europe. Okay. Remember students, I had mentioned Marco Polo before, who had travelled through Asia along the Silk Route between 1271 and 1295. In this period, he had spent 17 long years in China. During his stay, he had seen the system of printing there. So when he returned to Venice in 1295, he carried the knowledge of woodblock printing along. This is how print came to Europe, and Italy was the first country to use this technology. After this printing technology spread to other countries of Europe. Woodblock method soon became popular. But before I elaborate more on the popularity of hand printing, let me tell you that there was a small group or say section who did not like the scripts being written on ordinary papers. These books were considered as cheap quality books by them. Such group was mainly the aristocrats and the rich monastic libraries. So what did this group prefer? They preferred manuscripts written on vellum, which means that despite development of woodblock printing, manuscripts continued to be handwritten to cater to such group. Vellum is, dear students, a parchment made from the skin of animals. Parchments were prepared for the very purpose of writing on them. Okay. Woodblock printing was gaining popularity. Merchants and students in the university bought the cheaper printed copies. Booksellers all over the Europe began to export books to many different countries. The demand for books increased. Such was the demand of books that the booksellers were having a hard time meeting the demands of books. So, production of handwritten manuscripts was also organized in new ways. Booksellers had to employ more and more scribes. More than 50 scribes often worked together for one bookseller. But these measures also were not adequate. They could not satisfy the ever-increasing demand for books. Why? Because handwritten manuscripts suffered from some serious limitations. Dear students, copying manuscripts was expensive, laborious as well as time-consuming business. Besides, manuscripts were fragile, you can say they were delicate, they were difficult to handle. Also, it was not easy to carry them easily. Hence, their circulation was limited. Understood? So, with the growing demand for books, woodblock printing gradually became more and more popular. Most of Europe had come to adopt hand printing technology. They were being widely used to print textiles, playing cards, and religious pictures with brief texts. Now, there was clearly a great need for even quicker and cheaper reproduction of texts. Luckily, a major breakthrough occurred in Germany in the 1430s. Johann Gutenberg developed the first known printing press. As a result, my dear students, the world of print moved from the hand printing to mechanical printing. By 1448, he had perfected the system of letterpress printing. Gutenberg was the son of a merchant. He had spent his childhood in an agricultural estate where he had seen the wine and olive oil presses. In wine presses, students, grapes are squeezed to make wines. Similarly, in olive presses, olive is pressed to take out olive oil. The process is same. You can see an old olive mechanical screw press in the screen. Thereafter, Gutenberg became a goldsmith and learned to make molds, which was used to make trinkets. In Hindi, mold means sacha. They are used to give shapes to something. In brick kilns, molds are used to give shapes to bricks. So basically, Gutenberg got the idea for his printing press from the olive press, and the knowledge of making mold helped him casting the metal types for the letters. This is Gutenberg printing press. You can see how closely it resembles the olive presses. This press could print 250 sheets per hour. Books were produced much faster than before. The first book Gutenberg printed was the Bible. About 180 copies of Bibles were printed, of which no more than 50 have survived now. It took 3 years to produce them. You can see the pages of Gutenberg's Bible here. The text type is printed in the new Gutenberg press with metal type. If you see the borders, they are carefully designed, painted and illuminated by hand by artists. No two copies were the same. Every page of the copy was different. In the text you will see that the use of colors within the letters in various places. This served two purposes. First, it added color to the page, and second, it highlighted all the holy words to emphasize their significance. Gutenberg printed the text in black and left space where the color was to be filled later. So students, in the next 100 years between 1450 and 1550, Gutenberg press was set up in most countries in Europe. Printers from Germany headed to different countries looking for work as well as in assisting to start new presses. Production of books boomed with this new technology. This technology led to the print revolution, and we find a shift from hand printing to mechanical printing. Let us now revise Unit 3, the print revolution and its impact. The print revolution, my dear students, brought a big change. You can say it began the era of mass communication. It did not just introduce a new way of producing books, it transformed the lives of the people. There was a dramatic increase in literacy which broke the monopoly of the literate elite on education and learning. It changed the relationship to the information and knowledge. It opened the doors of knowledge for the people. The unrestricted circulation of information and ideas, particularly the revolutionary ones, threatened the power of political and religious authorities. It encouraged debates and discussions on written texts and encouraged freedom of opinion of important issues. Students, it is said that with the printing press, a new reading public emerged. Then what was the scene before the advent of the printing press? Let us see. Books were expensive. They could not be prepared in sufficient numbers. Reading of books was restricted to the elite. Common people only heard the books read out by others. These could be simple books, ballads or folk tales. Ballad is, dear students, a historical account or a folk tale in verse. That means they were like a poem or a song and were passed orally from one generation to the other. Okay, so you may call these people the hearing public. Okay, all this underwent a change with the print revolution. Printing reduced the cost of books. The time and labor required to produce each book came down. Multiple copies of the books could be produced easily now. Books flooded the market. They began reaching out to a wider section of people. It included all those who could afford to buy books. Thus, access to books created a new culture of reading. Hence, if earlier there was a hearing public, now there is a reading public. Hearing public comprised primarily those who were illiterate and who could not afford to buy books. Reading public comprised of all those persons who were literate and could buy a book. But was the transition from the hearing public to reading public so simple when the literacy rate in most European countries was very low? It was a tough task for the publishers to reach out to the common people. Publishers wanted that even those who could not read should at least enjoy listening to the books. They kept in mind the taste of the listeners, so they began publishing popular ballads and folk tales. These books were profusely illustrated with pictures. That means it contained a lot of pictures. These ballads and folk tales were then sung and recited at the gatherings in villages and in the taverns in towns. So see the fun. Oral culture first entered print and then printed material got orally transmitted. Thus, books began to reach the so-called hearing public also. This is how students, the hearing public and the reading public got intermingled. After the coming of print, people began to write and publish their works. Thus, there was a wide circulation of ideas and thus introduced a new world of debate and discussion. Previously, this was not possible for the want of any such medium. Print provided them the medium to vent their feelings, views, or ideas. Those who did not agree with the established authorities could now print and circulate their ideas. Through the printed message, they could persuade people to think differently and move them to action. That is why not everyone welcomed the printed books, and even those who did welcome also had fears about it. There were apprehensions that easier access to the printed word and the wider circulation of books would have an adverse effect on people's mind. It was also feared that if there was no control over what was printed and read, then rebellious and irreligious thoughts might spread. Some people thought that an easy availability of cheap, low quality books might also damage the prestige and status of valuable literature. So students, the anxiety expressed by religious authorities and monarchs, as well as many writers and artists, became the basis of criticism of the new printed literature that had begun to circulate. Okay, let us see one case that happened in Germany. This is about Martin Luther, who is considered a religious reformer in the early 16th century. He was very grateful to print. He had expressed his view when he said, "Printing is the ultimate gift of God and the greatest one." Martin Luther wrote 95 Theses. In this, he contested many practices and rituals of the Roman Catholic Church. He challenged the Church to debate his ideas. Luther's writings were printed and reproduced in vast numbers. Naturally, they were widely read. This led to a division within the church and the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Dear students, print and popular religious literature stimulated many individual interpretations of faith, even among little educated working people. Let us see another case from Italy. Manacchio was a miller in Italy. He began to read books that were available in his locality. Then he reinterpreted the message of the Bible and formulated his own view of God and creation. Naturally, the Roman Catholic Church got angry. Monacchio was arrested and ultimately executed. So the church was greatly disturbed by these developments. They could not allow any questioning on faith. And so, to check this growing tendency caused by printed literatures, the church began to maintain an index of prohibited books from 1558 onwards. That means they started maintaining a record of such books. Erasmus was a Latin scholar. He was also a Catholic reformer. He criticized the excesses of Catholicism. He was basically not against the concept of a book, but he was against irresponsible books. Erasmus did acknowledge that books do contribute something worth knowing, but he was sure that this can never happen if a glut of books begin to hit the market. Let us now revise the next unit, the reading mania. Students, in the 17th and 18th century, churches had started setting up schools in villages, thus carrying literacy to peasants and artisans. As literacy spread, people wanted to read. Printers responded by producing attractive books on varied topics of common man, thus fueling the reading habit further. This phenomenon actually has been referred to here as the reading mania in Europe. As a result of this reading mania, some significant developments took place in Europe, like new forms of literature appeared in print. The books were mainly almanac, ballads, folk tales, etc. Then, publishers used different methods to promote sale of books. They employed peddlers. Peddlers means someone who goes from place to place in order to sell something. So peddlers carried books and roamed around villages to sell them. To target the poor readers, the booksellers started to produce very cheap books. For example, in England, they printed chapbooks. Chapbooks were pocket-sized books and were sold for a penny. They were so called because they were sold by peddlers called chapmen. Similarly, in France, such low-priced books were called bibliothèque bleus. Blues because they were bound in cheap blue colors. Then there were romances to engage young readers and histories which had stories of the past. The print revolution students also led to the growth of newspapers and periodicals. Periodical means just like magazines which are published at regular intervals, maybe daily, weekly or monthly. The periodical press developed from the early 18th century. They gave information about current affairs and entertainment. Then there were newspapers and journals. They carried information on war and trade. They also covered news of development in other places. Students, things did not stop here. They went beyond this. Common people got access to the ideas of scientists and philosophers also. Scientific tests were now compiled and published. Maps and scientific diagrams were printed. When scientists like Isaac Newton began to publish their discoveries, they could reach to a much wider audience, especially those who were scientific-minded readers. Similarly, the ideas of philosophers like Thomas Paine, Voltaire, and Rousseau were also printed and read. They also came to be widely appreciated. In short, new ideas about science, reason, and rationality found their way into popular literature. Thus, students' reading became a passion with many. There was a common perception that books were a means of spreading progress and enlightenment. They believed that books could change the world and liberate the society from despotism and tyranny. Louis Sebastien Mercier was one person. Mercier was a novelist in 18th century France. So you can see he was contemporary to the period of French Revolution. He was strongly influenced by Rousseau. Mercier said, "The printing press is the most powerful engine of progress, and public opinion is the force that will sweep despotism away. In many of Mercier's novels, the heroes are shown transformed by the acts of reading. He was so much convinced of the power of print in bringing enlightenment and destroying despotism that he proclaimed, "Tremble, therefore, tyrants of the world, tremble before the virtual writer." Tremble means to shake out of fear, anxiety, or excitement. By saying so, he is actually warning the tyrants, that is, the despots or the dictators, that with the coming of print, their time is going to be over. Many historians, dear students, argue that the print culture created the conditions within which French Revolution occurred. You are already aware of the role of philosophers like Locke, Rousseau, and Montesquieu in the French Revolution. The point here is how their ideas popularized. It is the print that popularized their ideas. Their writings collectively provided a critical commentary on traditions, superstitions, or the despotism. Secondly, it was print which created a culture of dialogue and debate. All values, norms, and institutions of society were re-evaluated and discussed by the public. Thirdly, there were a number of literatures that mocked at the royalty and criticized their morality. Cartoons showed that the monarchs were absorbed in the sensual pleasures when the common people suffered hardships. Circulation of cartoons like this one had an impact on the thinking of people before revolution. This led to growth of hostile sentiments against the monarchy. Thus, since print helped people to open their minds and think differently, some historians think that print culture created the basis for the French Revolution. Let us now revise quickly Unit 5, the 19th century. The new readers in the 19th century were largely among children, women, and workers. Dear students, primary education had become compulsory in many countries in Europe. Therefore, children became an important category of readers. The publishing industry responded positively to this opportunity by taking a number of steps. School textbooks were given a priority in the production plan of different publishers. In France, a children press devoted to literature for children alone. It was set up in 1857. The press published new books as well as old fairy tales. In Germany, the Grimm brothers spent years compiling traditional folk tales from the rural areas. These tales were published in 1812. A special effort was made to exclude those tales that were considered unsuitable for the children or appeared vulgar to the elites. Okay. Women also emerged as a large segment of the reading public. Penny magazines were published especially for women. These manuals taught women proper behavior and housekeeping. Many women also began to write novels and get published. These were addressed to the issues facing women. Some of the best known novelists were women like Jane Austen, the Brown sisters, George Eliot, etc. The print revolution contributed to the emergence of a new type of women. This new woman was defined as a person with will, strength of personality, determination, and the power to think. Let us discuss workers now. Lending libraries existed since 17th century onwards. These libraries became instrumental for educating white-collar workers, artisans, and lower middle class people in England. Many good authors emerged from this class of society. They wrote and got their autobiographies published. Such books narrated their struggles to read against grim obstacles. Let us now see different innovations in the printing press during the 19th century. First innovation came in the form of power-driven cylindrical press. This was perfected by Richard M. Hoe in 1843. In this kind of press, images to be printed are curved around a cylinder, so it was more useful in printing newspapers. This machine was able to print 8,000 sheets per hour. Second was the coming of offset press in the late 19th century. This enabled printing with 6 colors at a time. Then came the electrically operated presses. This further accelerated the printing operations. Then there were improvements in the methods of feeding paper. Automatic paper reels and photoelectric controls of color registers were also introduced. These were some developments. Now, before we wind up the class, let us see what new strategies the publishers and printers developed to sell their products. Periodicals started to serialize the novels in the 19th century. That means the story was published in installments. In the 1920s in England, popular works were sold on cheap series called shilling series. The dust cover or the book jacket is also a 20th century innovation. So these were some innovations that publishers tried to sell their products. Let us now go to the next unit, India and the world of print. Dear students, before the advent of printing technology, ideas and information were conveyed by means of handwritten manuscripts. Manuscripts were written in different languages like Sanskrit, Arabic and Persian. These were handwritten on palm leaves or on handmade paper. At times, the pages were beautifully illustrated. They would then either be pressed between wooden covers or sewn together to ensure preservation. Manuscripts continued to be written even after the coming of print. But these handwritten manuscripts suffered from certain limitations. They were highly expensive, they were fragile, they had to be handled carefully, they could not be read easily as the script was written in different styles. Overall, manuscripts were not a common mode of communication. Now the question arises, in the absence of textbooks, how did the students study in schools? Students actually did not read books, they only learned to write. Teachers used to dictate them the portion of text from memory and students used to write them. This is how many people became literate without ever actually reading any kind of textbook. Understood? Let us now trace the evolution of the English language presses in India. The printing press first came to India in the 16th century. They were brought by the Portuguese missionaries in Goa. The Jesuit priests first learned Konkani and then printed several tracts. By 1674, about 50 books were published in Konkani and in Kannada. Later on, books were printed in Tamil and Malayalam also, all by Catholic priests. The English language press began to grow only from the late 17th century. The initiative was taken by the Englishmen to develop it. James Augustus Hickey. He was an Englishman. He was not connected either with the British government or the East India Company. He began publication of his weekly newspaper Bengal Gazette in Calcutta in 1780. Hickey published a lot of advertisements, including those that related to the import and sale of slaves. But he had published a lot of gossips about the company's senior officials in India. Warren Hastings, the Governor General of India, got enraged by this. Hickey was prosecuted and thrown into prison. Although his newspaper was disliked by the then Governor General of India, Warren Hastings, Hickey influenced many Indians to start newspapers. Soon thereafter, Indians also began to write and publish in English. The first to appear was a weekly named Bengal Gazette by Gangadhar Bhattacharya. So Hickey's Bengal Gazette was the first ever British newspaper of India. The Bengal Gazette that was started by Gangadhar Bhattacharya was the first Indian one. Let us now revise the next unit, religious reforms and public debates. 19th century in India students was a period when various social beliefs and values were under pressure. These began to be questioned now. This upheaval was common to all communities belonging to different faiths, be it Hindus or Muslims. Print culture made a significant contribution in this process. People began to give different interpretations to the religious beliefs. Some people criticized existing practices and campaigned for reforms. Others countered the arguments of reformers. Students, this was the only period of intense controversies between religious reformers and the Hindu orthodoxy over questions of sati, idolatry, and monotheism. Idolatry means the worship of idols, that means Murti Puja. Monotheism means the belief that there is only one God. Ram Mohan Roy was a social reformer. You have already read him in class 8. Ram Mohan Roy published the Samvad Kaumudi in 1821 to support his ideas. To counter him, the Hindu orthodoxy published Samachar Chandrika. Now, the Muslim dynasties had collapsed by the end of 19th century. The ulama were scared of the impact of the colonial culture on Muslims. Ulama or ulema are the scholars of Islam and the Sharia. They were afraid that the Muslim would change Muslim personal law and encourage conversion from Islam to Christianity. So what did they do to counter this? They used cheap lithographic presses to print Persian and Urdu translations of the Holy Scriptures. They printed religious newspapers and tracts. The Deoband Seminary was founded to safeguard the interests of the Muslims. Then they published thousands of fatwas by which they directed the Muslims how to conduct themselves in their everyday life. In the 19th century, many Muslim sects appeared for the cause of Muslim religion. Urdu print also helped them to fight against English influence in public. Let us now see what print did to encourage reading of religious texts among Hindus. The first printed edition of Ramcharitmanas written by Tulsidas came out from Calcutta in 1810. From the 1880s, the Naval Kishore Press at Lucknow and Sri Venkateshwar Press in Bombay published a number of religious books in vernacular. Printed and portable forms of such books helped the religious people to read them anywhere, anytime. They could also be read out to a large group of illiterate people, whether men or women. Discussions, debates, and controversies within and among different religious sects also started. Let us now go to the next unit, new forms of publications. Dear students, with the spread of literacy and knowledge, people wanted to see their own lives, experiences, emotions, and relationships reflected in what they read. Thus, a number of new forms of publications emerged as a response. Let us see them one by one. First, novel. Dear students, novels had originally developed in Europe but developed in India in the 19th century. The reading public and the print helped in this process. Some of the earliest novels were written in Bengali and Marathi. Then, besides novel, lyrics, short stories and essays came to be written. They included social and political issues. Then came visual images. By the end of 19th century, a new visual culture was taking shape. With the setting up of printing presses, pictures could be easily reproduced in multiple copies. Students, Raja Ravi Verma was a great Indian painter and artist. He created images for mass circulation. His paintings attracted common people, especially those with artistic tastes. During his lifetime, Verma is most remembered for his paintings of sari-clad women portrayed as graceful. Raja Ravi Verma produced a number of mythological paintings that were printed at the Raja Ravi Verma Press. Then came calendars. Cheap prints and calendars were also printed and made available in the markets. These were bought by the poor people to decorate the walls of their homes. Cartoons and caricatures were yet another form of publication. Caricatures and cartoons began to appear in journals and newspapers in the 1870s. Some caricatures mocked the educated India's fascination with Western tastes and clothes. Some cartoons expressed the fear of social change. These caricatures had an effect on the minds of people. Nationalists were mocked by imperial caricatures, and imperial rule was mocked by national cartoons. This is all about new forms of publications. Let us now see women and print. My dear students, with the coming of print, the number of women readers also increased enormously, particularly in middle class homes. One of the important reasons for this was that a large section of print culture in different languages was devoted to the education of women. Thereby, women took great interest in reading and writing. Many journals printed writings by women where they explained why women should be educated. For those women or girls who had no education or were not allowed to go to schools, many journals also carried a syllabus along with reading material that could be used for home-based schooling. So, liberal fathers began educating their daughters and liberal husbands started educating their wives. When school for women were opened, they started to send them to schools. But all families did not think in the same way. Conservative Hindus believed that a literate girl would become widow. Muslims were afraid that educated women would be corrupted by reading Urdu romances. So, what are these views? Basically, these are hurdles towards women's education. Your textbook mentions the story of Rasha Sundari Devi. She was born in East Bengal. She did not get formal education and was married at a very young age. She learned to read in the secrecy of her kitchen. Later on, she wrote her autobiography and she is the first Indian woman to write an autobiography, Amar Jibon, which means My Life. It was written in Bangla in 1876. There is another Bengali woman, Kailash Bashini Devi. She wrote books about the experiences of women, about how women had to remain at home, kept in ignorance, forced to do hard domestic chores, and how they were ill-treated by the family members. Then, from present-day Maharashtra, we have women like Tarabai Shinde, Pandita Ramabai. They wrote about the miserable condition of the upper caste Hindu women, especially widows. In the 20th century, journals written for and edited by women became extremely popular. They discussed issues, especially those related to women, like women's education, widowhood, like widow remarriage, and even national movement. Besides these issues, written material also offered household lessons or fashion lessons to women. In Punjab, Khalsa Tract Society used to publish cheap booklets, many in the form of dialogues about qualities of a good woman. Ram Chadda published Stri Dharm Vichar. The name is self-explanatory. This book teaches women how to be a good wife. Let us now see print and the poor people. Dear students, the spread of print culture had also impacted the poor people of India in the 19th century. The poor people were for the first time exposed to printed literature. Cheap small books came to be published. These were sold at crossroads. Hence, they were easily available to the poor at affordable price. Public libraries were set up in the early 20th century. Through such network of libraries, poor people got an easy access to books. Issues of caste discrimination began to be written about in many printed tracts and essays. Jyotiba Phule, dear students, was one of the most vocal among the low caste leaders. He wrote about the injustices of the caste system in his book Gulamgiri in 1871. Gulamgiri means slavery. Significant contributions were also made by Dr. Ambedkar in Maharashtra, E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar in Madras. Their writings were read all over India. Workers mostly lacked education to write about their experiences, but Kashi Baba, a mill worker from Kanpur, wrote and published Chote aur Bade Ka Sawal to show the link between caste and class exploitation. Another mill worker from Kanpur, under the name Sudarshan Chakra, published his collection of poems called Sachi Kahaniyan. By the 1930s, Bangalore cotton mill workers set up libraries to educate themselves. These libraries were actually sponsored by social reformers who wanted to restrict drinking among the workers, who wanted to bring literacy among the workers, and sometimes to propagate the message of nationalism. Let us now finish the last unit, print and censorship. Dear students, till 1798, the East India Company had no problems with the Indian publications. If they had any, it was against Englishmen in India who reported company's misrule and hated the actions of company officers. They were worried that such criticisms might adversely affect their trade monopoly in India. In the 1820s, the Calcutta Supreme Court had of course passed certain regulations to control freedom of press. So the company began encouraging publications of newspapers that celebrated British rule. But the attitude to the freedom of press changed only after the revolt of 1857. The influence of Indian language newspapers had grown significantly by 1870. They had become assertively nationalist. These began to be perceived as a threat by the colonial administration. This led to the enactment of the Vernacular Press Act of 1878. So what were the provisions of this act? This act provided the government extensive rights to censor reports and editorials in the vernacular press. It excluded English language publications. Now the government kept tracking the vernacular newspapers. If they found something seditious, the newspaper was warned first. But if the warning was ignored, then the press was liable to be seized and the printing machinery confiscated. So the act aimed at silencing any attempts by the Indian language press to criticize the government. But despite these measures, nationalist newspapers grew in number in all parts of India. They kept on reporting on colonial misrule and encouraged nationalist activities. There were protests against any attempts that tried to throttle nationalist criticism. Bal Gangadhar Tilak students was one of the strongest critics of British rule. He edited a Marathi newspaper, Kesari. When Punjab revolutionaries were deported to Andaman in 1907, Tilak had shown a sympathy for them in his newspaper. As a result, he was imprisoned in 1908. Now, before we wind up the class, look at some of the pictures that may be a part of your 1-mark questions. This is Diamond Sutra, the oldest Japanese book. This is Tripitaka Koreana, belonging to the mid-13th century. Printing wood blocks of the Tripitaka Koreana are a Korean collection of Buddhist scriptures. This is ukiyo print by Kitagawa Utamaro. This is the portrait of Johann Gutenberg. Pages from the Geet Govind of Jaydev. This is a print by Ravi Verma, Raja Ritudhwaj rescuing Princess Madalsa from the captivity of demons. Dear students, this is all in the revision of this lesson. I hope you must have benefited from this class. In the next class, we will meet with one short revision of another lesson. Till then, happy reading and have a nice time. Thank you.